I thought my parents loved me equally. I thought when the doctor said the word surgery, the people who raised me would be the first ones to reach for their wallets, their phones, their arms, anything to help. I was wrong. What I didn't know, lying in that hospital bed with a diagnosis that felt like a sentence, was that the people I had spent my entire life trying to please had already decided I wasn't worth the cost. And the only person who showed up, the one I had always quietly underestimated, the one everyone in our family called a failure, was my brother Danny, who worked double shifts at a warehouse and drove a car with a cracked windshield and had exactly $400 in his checking account. He gave me everything he had, and then he gave me more. Let me tell you what it feels like to discover that love in your family has always had a price tag, and that you were never worth the full amount. My name is Clara. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, in a house that always smelled faintly of my mother's lavender candles and my father's aftershave, and something underneath both of those things. Something I could never quite name until the day I lay in a hospital gown staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles and realized it was the smell of conditions, of love that was always, always conditional. On paper, we were a good family. My father, Robert, worked in insurance for 26 years and wore the same brand of dress shirt every single day of his life. He was the kind of man who believed in appearances above almost everything else. The right neighborhood, the right car, the right church pew on Sunday mornings. My mother, Patricia, ran the household with the kind of quiet efficiency that looked, from the outside, like warmth. She made casseroles for neighbors when someone died. She kept a perfectly organized address book. She called me every Sunday at exactly 11 in the morning, and the calls lasted precisely 20 minutes, and they always ended the same way, with her reminding me of something I had failed to do, something I had forgotten to say, some small inadequacy that she delivered, wrapped in the soft packaging of maternal concern. Danny was 4 years younger than me. He had dropped out of college after 2 semesters, not because he wasn't smart, but because he couldn't stop caring about people long enough to sit still in a lecture hall. He'd worked a dozen different jobs: waiter, delivery driver, youth soccer coach, warehouse loader. He drove a 2009 Civic with one headlight slightly dimmer than the other and a crack in the passenger side windshield that he covered with a strip of clear tape. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes outside of town and ate a lot of frozen burritos, and called me every few weeks to tell me about some book he'd found at the thrift store or some stray cat he'd taken in. My parents had long since stopped asking about his career trajectory. They didn't say it outright. They never said anything outright. But the way they'd grow quiet when his name came up, the way my mother would click her tongue and change the subject, told you everything you needed to know about how they'd filed him in their minds. I, on the other hand, had always been the achiever, the good daughter. I had a degree in accounting, a job at a mid-sized firm where I'd been promoted twice, a small but decent apartment that I'd furnished carefully over the years. I sent birthday cards on time. I came home for every holiday. I listened to my mother's advice even when it made my jaw tight and my hands curl into fists under the dinner table. I had spent my entire adult life quietly, desperately trying to be enough. And I had been rewarded for it with exactly the kind of hollow approval that looks like love until you need the real thing. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in late October. I had been ignoring the pain in my abdomen for longer than I should have, months if I'm honest, writing it off as stress, as something I'd eaten, as the kind of vague physical complaint that busy people learn to dismiss. But when it got bad enough that I couldn't sleep, couldn't sit through a workday without gripping the edge of my desk, I finally went in. The ultrasound showed a large ovarian cyst, complex in structure, wrapped around tissue it shouldn't have been near. The doctor, a calm, matter-of-fact woman named Dr. Reeves, who I immediately liked for her complete absence of unnecessary reassurance, told me I needed surgery. Not eventually. Not if things got worse. Now. The following week, if possible. The surgery itself was covered mostly by my insurance, but the coverage had gaps. A deductible I hadn't met, a surgical facility fee that fell into a gray zone in my policy, and a follow-up care plan that my insurance classified as elective management. The total out-of-pocket estimate came to just over $5,000. $5,080 to be exact. I remember the number precisely because I stared at the estimate sheet for a long time in the parking lot of the medical building, sitting in my car with the engine off and the October wind rocking the vehicle slightly, and I did the math 3 times in my head before accepting that it was real. I had some savings, but not enough. Not without wiping out the emergency fund I'd spent 3 years building, the one that sat in my account like a small, carefully tended garden. The one I had promised myself I would never touch unless the world genuinely fell apart. I told myself that surgery counted as the world falling apart, but there was something about completely draining that account, something about being left with zero, that felt like more than a financial decision. It felt like erasure, like undoing something I had worked very hard to build. So I called my parents. I want to be precise about how I felt in the moments before I made that call, because I think it matters. I was not panicking. I was not in hysterics. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm in the pale, tired light of a Tuesday evening, and I was calm. The kind of calm that comes not from confidence, but from the simple fact that the situation seemed so clear. I needed surgery. My parents had money, not vast wealth, but comfort. A paid-off house, retirement savings, a vacation fund my mother referenced every spring when she and my father went somewhere warm. $5,000 was not nothing to them, but it was also not a crisis. I was their daughter. I was sick. This was, I thought, the simplest equation in the world. My mother answered on the second ring. I told her everything. The diagnosis, the surgery date, the insurance gaps, the number. I kept my voice steady. I told her I would pay it back, every dollar on a schedule, in writing if they wanted. I told her I wasn't asking for a gift, just a loan. I told her the surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday, and that I was a little scared, and that it would mean a lot to me to know that things were handled, financially, so I could focus on getting through it. There was a pause. The kind of pause that is not thoughtful, but strategic. The kind that tells you the person on the other end already knows what they're going to say and is simply deciding how to wrap it. "Clara," my mother said, and the way she said my name, gently, with that particular inflection that always preceded a disappointment delivered as wisdom, made my stomach tighten. "You know we would do anything for you." I waited. "But your father and I have been talking, and, well, we've just committed a very significant amount to the renovations. The kitchen, and the back porch. We've already put down the deposit and the contractor starts next week, and we simply don't have that kind of liquidity right now. You understand?" I understood that she had said the word liquidity to me while I was telling her I needed surgery. "Mom," I said, "it's $5,000. For surgery, for a medical procedure that's happening next week." "I know, sweetheart, and we feel terrible, but you're so capable, Clara. You always figure things out, and honestly..." Another pause, shorter this time, a different kind. "You have savings. You've always been so good about that. This is exactly what an emergency fund is for." I sat with that for a moment. She knew about my emergency fund because I had once, in a moment of pride, mentioned it to her during one of our Sunday calls. She had filed it away. She was using it now like a card from a deck she'd been quietly building for years to explain to me why my need was not urgent enough, not real enough, not worth disrupting their kitchen renovation. "I'll let you talk to your father," she said. My father came on the line with the specific brand of gruff tenderness he deployed when he needed to say no but wanted to feel like a good person. "Clara Bear," he said, the childhood nickname that he only ever used when he was about to deny me something. "Your mother explained the situation. Look, You know we'd help if we could, but we're stretched thin right now, and you're a smart girl. You'll work it out." He paused. "Have you called your insurance company? Sometimes these estimates are inflated. I'd push back on the facility fee." He was advising me to haggle with a hospital billing department rather than loan me $5,000. "I have to go," I said. "I'll figure it out." I set my phone down on the table and sat very still. The tea was cold now. The kitchen light buzzed faintly. Outside, a car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling, and then it was gone, and the apartment was quiet, and I sat in that quiet and felt something I didn't have a name for yet, something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but sat exactly where those two things meet, in the cold center of your chest, like a stone that has been there a long time and that you have only just noticed. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I sat at that table for a long time, and I thought about every Sunday phone call, every holiday dinner, every moment I had swallowed my real feelings and smiled and been the good daughter, the easy daughter, the daughter who figured things out. And I thought about the kitchen renovation and the contractor starting next week and the word liquidity. And I let myself understand, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, what had always been true, that in my family's economy of love, I had always been expected to give and never to cost anything. I went to bed. I did not sleep. 3 days later, Danny called me. He called on a Friday evening, which was not unusual. He called whenever something occurred to him, without schedule or ceremony, the way people do when they're not performing a relationship but actually having one. I answered, and before I could say anything, he said, "Hey, Mom told me about the surgery. Why didn't you tell me?" There was something in his voice, a directness, an absence of the careful packaging, that made my throat tighten unexpectedly. "I didn't want to worry you," I said. "You're busy. Clara." He said my name the way my mother never did. Plain, no inflection, just my name, meaning stop it. "How much do you need?" I told him. I was surprised by my own honesty. I had half intended to deflect, to minimize, to do the thing I always did, which was to make myself smaller so that no one would have to feel the discomfort of my need. But something about the directness of his question stripped that impulse away. There was a silence on his end. Not strategic, just a person thinking. "Okay," he said. "Danny, you don't have—" "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. How do I send it?" "You don't have $5,000, I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just true, and I knew it, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise." "I have some," he said, "and I can get the rest. Don't worry about how. Just send me your Venmo." I want to tell you that I argued harder, that I put up more resistance, but the truth is I was tired and scared and very, very alone in a way that I hadn't let myself fully feel until that moment. And the sound of his voice, certain and unhurried, reached through the phone and steadied something in me that had been shaking for 3 days. So I sent him my Venmo. The money arrived in 2 transfers. The first, for $3,000, came that same night at 11:47 p.m. The second, for $2,080, came the following Monday morning. When I called him to ask where the second transfer had come from, because I knew he didn't have that much, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I cashed out my 401k. It's fine, I'll rebuild it." He had cashed out his retirement account. For me. I didn't speak for a long moment. The morning light was coming through my kitchen window, thin and gold, and I was standing at the counter with my phone pressed hard against my ear, and I felt something crack open in my chest. Not painfully, but the way a window cracks open in spring when the air outside is finally warmer than the air inside and you realize the cold has been sealed in for so long you forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. "Danny," I said. "Don't," he said. Not unkindly, just don't make a thing of it. "I'm paying you back," I said. "Every dollar. With interest." "Sure," he said, in the tone of someone who does not actually intend to hold you to that. "How are you feeling? About the surgery?" And just like that, we moved on to the thing that actually mattered, because that was Danny. That was always Danny. Moving straight past the gesture to the person, past the money to the fear underneath it, past the surface of things to what was actually real. I had the surgery on a Thursday. It went well. Dr. Reeves told me afterward that they'd caught it at the right time, that the cyst had been larger than the imaging suggested, that another few weeks could have complicated things significantly. I lay in the recovery room with warm blankets tucked around me and a dull, distant ache where the pain used to be, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about my parents' kitchen renovation and my brother's retirement account and the distance between those two things. A distance that had no unit of measurement I could name, but that felt, in that quiet recovery room, like the most important distance in the world. My mother called that evening to ask how the surgery had gone. The call lasted 11 minutes. She told me she was relieved it had gone well, asked if I was eating, mentioned that the contractor had started on the back porch and it was looking wonderful, and reminded me to send a thank you note to Dr. Reeves. She did not ask how I had paid for it. My father texted, "Glad you're on the mend. Rest up." Danny drove 3 hours to bring me soup. He showed up at my apartment the day after I was discharged, carrying a pot of actual homemade chicken soup. He had made it the night before, from scratch, with a recipe he'd found online, and a paperback he'd picked up from a thrift store because he thought I'd like it. And he sat with me on my couch for 5 hours, and we watched terrible reality television, and he didn't once mention the money or the surgery or our parents, and I didn't either. And it was the most cared for I had felt in longer than I could remember. But the thing about cracks, once something opens, it doesn't close on its own. The surgery gave me time. Recovery meant 2 weeks mostly at home, quiet days with too much space for thinking, and I found myself returning again and again to the same set of facts. My parents had a paid-off house and a vacation fund and enough disposable income to renovate their kitchen, and they had told their daughter, who needed surgery, who was scared, who had asked for a loan, not a gift, that they were stretched thin. And my brother, who worked a warehouse job and drove a car with a cracked windshield and lived on frozen burritos, had liquidated his retirement savings without hesitation. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before, not looking for things, exactly, more like letting myself see what had always been there. I thought about the car my parents had bought for my cousin Marcus when he turned 17, a used but decent sedan just like that, because Marcus's father had asked, and my father had said yes. I thought about the money they'd given my aunt when she'd had the roof of her house replaced, $10,000, which my mother had mentioned at a family dinner with a kind of satisfied magnanimity, the gesture of people who were generous when generosity was visible. I thought about every birthday card I'd ever received from them, always a check inside, always the same amount, always with a note in my mother's handwriting that said something like, "For something practical." I thought about the way they had, once at a holiday dinner, praised Danny's potential in the same breath as lamenting his choices, as though he were a project they had long since stopped investing in. I thought about a Sunday call from 2 years ago, one I had nearly forgotten, when I had mentioned, casually, that I was thinking about going back to school for a specialized certification, and my mother had said, "Oh, Clara, at your age? That seems like a lot of money for something you might not even use." She'd been 43 when she said it. I had been 29. The picture that assembled itself during those 2 weeks of recovery was not dramatic. There was no single smoking gun, no moment of revelation, no document I discovered that changed everything. It was more like adjusting the focus on a lens you hadn't realized was blurred, and finding, in the sharpened image, a landscape you recognized completely but had never quite been willing to look at directly. My parents had never withheld love from me, not in the way that word is usually meant. They had fed me and sheltered me and put me through school and called every Sunday. But they had always, subtly, quietly, with the expertise of people who didn't even know they were doing it, communicated that their love was a function of how little I cost them, of how self-sufficient I was, how low maintenance, how capable of figuring it out. The moment I actually needed something real, something that required sacrifice, something that cost more than a check and a birthday card, they had weighed the cost against the kitchen renovation and found me lighter. And they had not once asked how I was going to manage. I was not angry yet, not the real anger, the one that moves you. That came later. What I felt during those 2 recovery weeks was something quieter, and in some ways worse. A grief for something I had never actually had. A mourning for the version of my parents that had only ever existed in the story I told myself about my family. But the story was changing, and I was finally, for the first time, letting it. The real anger arrived on a Sunday, 3 weeks after the surgery, 6 days after I'd returned to work, on one of my mother's scheduled 11 o'clock calls. She asked how I was feeling. I said fine. She asked if I was eating well. I said yes. She mentioned that the kitchen renovation was nearly complete and that the new countertops were a quartzite they'd found at a showroom in Columbus, and that my father had been resistant at first, but now he loved them. She said the words, quartzite countertops, with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing malicious in it. That was the worst part. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't rubbing anything in. She had simply moved on, fully and completely, to the next item in the comfortable life she and my father had built, and my surgery and my fear and my $5,000 were somewhere behind her, filed and closed, as orderly as her address book. "Mom," I said, and something in my voice must have been different because she paused in the middle of a sentence about grout color. "What is it?" "How did you think I paid for the surgery?" A beat. "Well, your savings, I assumed, like we talked about." "I didn't use my savings," I said. "Danny cashed out his 401k. The silence that followed was not the strategic kind. It was, for once, the genuine kind. The silence of a person who has been handed information they do not know what to do with. It lasted long enough that I heard my mother take a short breath, the kind she took when she was recalibrating. "Oh," she said, "well, Danny didn't have to do that." "No," I said, "he didn't. He chose to." "Clara, he works at a warehouse, Mom. He makes $32,000 a year. He doesn't have a vacation fund. He doesn't have a contractor starting next week. He had a retirement account, and he liquidated it. For me. Because I needed surgery, and you said you were stretched thin." I had not planned this conversation. I had not rehearsed it. The words came out in a voice I barely recognized as mine. Not loud, not shaking, but flat and precise, like a blade laid on a table. Clara, that's not fair. You don't know the full picture of our finances." "I know enough of it," I said. "I know about Marcus's car. I know about Aunt Sheila's roof. I know about the $10,000 you gave her 4 years ago because her contractor gave her a bad estimate. I was there at that dinner, Mom. I heard you tell it." Another silence. This one felt different, denser, more loaded. I heard my mother's breathing shift. "Those were different situations," she said carefully. "Sheila had nowhere else to turn. And I did." She didn't answer. "I had Danny," I said. "Apparently, that was where I had to turn." I heard her set something down. A mug, maybe, or the phone itself, briefly. When her voice came back, it had acquired the particular texture it got when she was feeling wronged, soft, slightly wounded, with a current of reproach underneath it. "I don't appreciate the implication that we don't love you, Clara. That is simply not—" "I'm not making an implication," I said. "I'm telling you what happened. You said no, he said yes. I'm just telling you what happened." "Your father and I will send you something," she said, "to help reimburse Danny. We can do that." "Don't," I said. Clara, don't send Danny anything. It's not about the money anymore. I paused. It never really was. I ended the call. I set my phone on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, looking out the window at the street below, at the ordinary Saturday afternoon traffic, people walking dogs and carrying groceries and living their lives in the mild autumn light. My hands were not shaking. My heart was not racing. I felt, if anything, very still. The way you feel after you've finally said the true thing, the thing that has been sitting inside you collecting weight for years and discovered that saying it does not destroy you, that it might, in fact, be the opposite. I called Danny. He picked up on the third ring. I could hear something in the background. A game, maybe, or the television. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. "I just wanted you to know I told Mom what you did, about the 401k. A pause. "How'd that go?" "About how you'd expect." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Yeah. She said they'd send you money to reimburse you." "I'll tell her not to bother." "I already told her." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You okay?" I thought about it honestly, the way I was starting to think about things, not performing an answer but actually checking. Was I okay? My abdomen still ached faintly if I moved wrong. My relationship with my parents had just shifted in a way I didn't think would fully shift back. The story I'd told myself about my family for 31 years was dismantling itself piece by piece, and standing in its rubble was not a comfortable feeling. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." "Good," Danny said. And then, "Have you eaten? I made too much chili." I laughed. It surprised me. A real laugh, sudden and genuine, the kind that breaks open something that's been held tight. "I'll come over," I said. "Door's unlocked." In the weeks that followed, I did something I hadn't done in years. I stopped performing. I stopped being the daughter who always figured things out, who never cost anyone anything, who smoothed things over and managed her own feelings so efficiently that no one ever had to manage them for her. I let myself be honest about what I needed and what I felt and who I actually was, outside the role I'd been quietly playing for most of my adult life. It was harder than I expected. The habit of smallness runs deep when you've spent decades cultivating it. There were moments, on a Sunday call, in a family group text, at Thanksgiving dinner in November, when I felt the old reflex kick in, the urge to deflect and minimize and be easy. I didn't always resist it cleanly, but I noticed it now, which was something I hadn't been able to do before, and noticing was the first step. Thanksgiving dinner was its own particular test. My parents hosted, as they always had, in the house I'd grown up in, now featuring the new quartzite countertops, which were, I had to admit to myself, genuinely beautiful, a cool dove gray that caught the light of the kitchen in a way the old laminate never had. My father made a show of greeting me at the door, pulling me into a hug that was a beat longer than usual, which was his way of acknowledging that something had happened between us without actually acknowledging it. My mother had made all my favorite dishes, which was also her way. Love expressed in casseroles and good china, in the language of effort, which was real and which I did not dismiss, but which I now understood was not the whole vocabulary of love, only part of it, the safe part. Danny came late, as he always did, in his jacket with the torn pocket lining that he kept meaning to get fixed. My mother hugged him. My father shook his hand. There was a moment, brief, slightly charged, when my father said, "Good of you to help your sister out," in the tone of a man completing a transaction, and Danny just looked at him for a second and said, "Yeah," and moved past it into the kitchen, and I watched my father's face do something complicated and then reset to its usual expression, and I thought, he knows. He knows exactly what he did and exactly what Danny did, and he is living with that, and it is not comfortable, and it should not be. We ate. We talked about things that were not the surgery, not the 401k, not the quartzite countertops' symbolic weight. We talked about football and the neighbors and my cousin Marcus's new girlfriend. It was, on the surface, a normal Thanksgiving dinner. Underneath it was the particular texture of a family that has had a real conversation. Not resolved it, not healed it, but had it, and must now continue to be a family anyway. It was uncomfortable and real, and I found bearable. More than bearable. It was honest, which was something our dinners had rarely been. After dessert, when my mother was in the kitchen and my father had fallen asleep in front of the game, Danny and I sat on the back porch, the newly built back porch, solid and clean and smelling of fresh lumber, in the cold November air, wrapped in coats we'd grabbed from the hallway. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Really?" "Better," I said. "Every week a little better." I looked out at the backyard, the old oak tree still there, the tire swing long since gone, but the branch still bearing the faint scar of the rope. I've been thinking about things differently, about what I want, what I'm willing to put up with, what I'm not. "That's good," he said. "That's really good, Clara." "I'm going back to school," I said. "That certification I was talking about a couple years ago. Mom said it was a lot of money for something I might not use. I've been thinking about it ever since, and I keep letting her voice be the loudest voice in the room, even when she's not in the room." I paused. "I'm going to do it anyway." Danny nodded slowly, looking out at the yard, his breath clouding in the cold. "About time," he said. There was no grand pronouncement in it. No big brother wisdom. Just about time. The way you'd say it to someone who finally ordered the thing on the menu they'd been eyeing for 20 minutes. We sat in the cold for a while longer, not talking, the sounds of the holiday drifting out through the kitchen window. My mother's voice, water running, the low sound of the television. The backyard was getting dark, the oak tree going soft and gray at the edges. I thought about the recovery room, the warm blankets, the water-stained ceiling tiles. I thought about the parking lot where I'd sat with the estimate sheet and done the math 3 times. I thought about 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night, a number appearing in my phone's notification. $3,000 from my brother who had $400 in his account. "Danny," I said. "Yeah, I'm going to pay you back. All of it. $500 a month starting in January." He was quiet for a moment. "You really don't have to." "I know," I said. "I want to." He looked at me then, sideways, and I could see in the dim light that he was smiling. Not a big smile, just the corner of his mouth. "Okay," he said. "And I'm going to match the early withdrawal penalty," I said. "Whatever you had to pay in taxes and fees on the 401k, I'm adding that on top." He started to say something. "Don't argue with me," I said. "I know what you're going to say, and the answer is no." He closed his mouth. The smile got slightly bigger. The back door opened and my mother leaned out, backlit by the warm kitchen light, and asked, did we want coffee? And we both said yes, and she went back inside, and Danny and I sat for one more minute in the cold and the quiet and the dark, in the honest and imperfect presence of each other. And it was enough. It was, actually, more than enough. The certification program started in February, 12 weeks, mostly online, with 2 in-person weekend intensives. Not cheap, but not ruinous, and worth every dollar. I was the second oldest person in the cohort and the only one juggling it around a full-time job. And there were Thursday nights when I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and my notes and my cold cup of tea and thought, this is the right kind of hard. This is the hard that is going somewhere. I passed the final assessment in May. My supervisor offered me a project lead role on the back of it, the kind of role I had been building toward for 2 years, with a title change and a salary adjustment that made a real difference. I called Danny first, before my parents, before my best friend, before anyone. He answered and I told him, and he said, I knew it, in the exact tone of someone who actually knew, and I laughed and he laughed, and we made plans for dinner the following weekend to celebrate. A real dinner, at a real restaurant, my treat, no argument. Then I called my parents. My mother said, "Oh, Clara, how wonderful," with a warmth that was genuine. My mother's pride in my achievements had always been genuine. That was the complicated truth of her, that she could love my success and still fail me when I needed her, and both things were real. My father got on the line and said, "That's my girl." And I let myself receive it, the complicated, imperfect love of imperfect people, without pretending it was more than it was or punishing it for not being what it wasn't. I didn't forget what had happened. I didn't pretend the surgery hadn't told me something true, but I had stopped needing them to be different in order to be okay myself. That was the shift, not in them, but in me. I had stopped outsourcing my okayness to people who had always been unreliable stewards of it. It's been 9 months now. The certification is framed on my wall. The new title is on my email signature. My emergency fund is growing back, and alongside it, a second account I opened specifically for paying Danny back. $500 a month, plus the penalty reimbursement calculated down to the dollar, growing steadily toward the number that will close this chapter. Danny got a new car in March. Not new, but new to him. A 2019 Subaru with all 4 headlights fully functional and no tape on the windshield. He texted me a photo the day he drove it off the lot, just the car in a parking lot in bright afternoon sun with no caption. And I sent back a string of heart emojis, and he sent back a thumbs up, and that was our whole conversation, and it was perfect. I sit on my own little balcony on Sunday mornings now. I moved to a slightly bigger apartment in the spring, one with a balcony that catches the morning sun, with coffee that is actually hot because I make it and drink it, and am not waiting for anyone's phone call. And I think about what I know now that I didn't know a year ago, not lessons I'd package up and hand to someone, more like the feeling of a room that used to be crowded with furniture you didn't choose, and that now, piece by piece, holds only what you actually want in it. I know who shows up. I know what showing up actually looks like. Not the call that lasts 20 minutes and ends with a gentle correction, but the late-night transfer and the pot of soup and the 5 hours on a couch watching bad television, and the one question that underneath it all is asking, "I see you. You are not alone. We will figure this out." I know that love is not the absence of conflict or the presence of comfort. It is the willingness to be inconvenienced, to sacrifice the thing you had planned, to cash out the thing you were saving without being asked twice, without making it about yourself, without needing credit for it afterward. Danny taught me that, not on purpose, just by being himself, quietly, without performance, without asking for applause. The brother my parents had written off as the family failure, the one who turned out to know more about love than any of us. The tire swing is gone from the oak tree in my parents' backyard, but the branch still holds the scar. That small roughness in the bark where the rope was tied all those years ago, and every Thanksgiving when I stand on the new back porch in the cold air, I look at it and think, that is where something was once held. That is proof that holding is possible, that things can bear more weight than you'd expect if they're given the chance. I am 31 years old. I have a certification on my wall and a balcony that catches the morning sun, and a brother who drove 3 hours to bring me soup when I was scared and alone. I have lost some illusions. I have gained something better. That is enough. More than enough. That is everything.